You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. My name is Ray Gerard. I am your host for this program. This is the program that asks, hey, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here, alive now, and could write a letter to Americans? We have letters that he wrote to the Colossians, the Corinthians, the Romans, the Ephesians. What about if he wrote a letter to Americans? What would he tell us? If he were alive, looking at what is going on in our society and our culture, what would he think is important enough that he would want to comment on? What would he want us to hear? What message would that be? Well, on this program, we give you precisely such a letter. And today, what we're going to be talking about is a recent Supreme Court decision that just came down called Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. This is the ruling where the court announced that it is illegal to discriminate in an employment situation against somebody on the basis of their gender identity or perhaps their homosexuality. How would St. Paul look at that? What would he want to tell us? I think what he would tell us is this. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. It is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, this is a familiar reading from St. Paul. It is often read at weddings. It's all about love. Now, why would we say that this particular message is applicable to the Supreme Court case that we talked about? Well, we're going to dive into that in some detail today. But it's a reading, as I say, that has often been heard. It was something that he wrote thousands of years ago. But it is something that he would write to us again today. It is a message he would want us to hear today. His writings, like all Scripture, are inspired by God. They contain truths that are timeless. They don't change from one place to another, from one situation to another, from one time or era to another. They are always true for all people everywhere. And certainly this message about love is always true every place, everywhere. If we are made in God's image, and God is love, then we are made to love others, made to love Him. But I would point out three particular things in this particular message. At one point he says, love, which is, as I say, the principal way for us to act, the guiding principle of our lives. He says it is not inflated. It is not inflated. What's another way of saying the same thing? It's humble. He also says that it rejoices with the truth. The truth is an important aspect of how we should live. And then he also says what? He says it endures all things. Why are those messages important? Why are those messages things that we ought to hear today? In particular, I would say, why are these messages things that our Supreme Court ought to hear? Well, the first part is this. The Supreme Court has just issued a ruling that says it is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was the law that said it is, among other things, in Title VII of that law, it said it is improper to discriminate against people applying for jobs on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Those five factors are prohibitions against people discriminating against others in employment settings. Well, why is it that our court has now said that includes gender identity, the word sex in that list of prohibitions, the word sex now includes gender identity or homosexual, same-sex persons. Why does this court all of a sudden say that? There's a dissenting opinion issued by Justice Alito in which he lays out in great detail the fact that the history behind this particular provision of the law has been for 50 years that the word sex did not include gender identity, did not include transgenderism, did not include homosexuality, that sex was understood for 50 years as what it has traditionally over centuries been understood to mean. Understood to mean simply the biological identities of people as either men or women. Now the court says it means something new, something different, something broader. And over that 50-year period, as Justice Alito points out, there have been various efforts to amend the Civil Rights Act to include gender identity and homosexuality. As a matter of fact, in Canada, they recently changed their laws for precisely the same reason. They felt the need to include specifically gender identity and homosexuality as protected classes of people. They had to say it explicitly. They changed their laws for that purpose. And there have been similar efforts here in the United States to change the laws in this way. Well, those efforts have not proved successful. Now, why would they even bother to make those efforts if they were completely unnecessary? If the word sex included gender identity and homosexuality to begin with, there'd be no need to change the law. The court has now said precisely that. There is no need to change the law. It includes these other categories. What has the court done? The court has, in effect, amended the law. It has saved these people the trouble of passing a new law. The court has written its own new law. Unless, in fact, these people are foolish, unless, in fact, there was no need, unless, in fact, there was this broader definition that existed from the very beginning. And that's, in fact, what the court has said, that if you apply and simply interpret and look at the words of the Civil Rights Act as they were written in 1964 and use the meanings given to those words as people understood them in 1964, that it includes, those words include transgenderism and homosexuality. So if the court is correct in that, then everybody else has been wrong. But the court has basically taken solace in the fact that that's all it really needs to do. It's not doing anything new. We're saying that, in fact, they've written their own law, but they would say different. They'd say, no, we're not writing the law. We're just simply looking at these words using the meanings given to such terms in 1964, so we are not doing anything new at all. How do they say that? How do they make this claim? Well, it's very simple. Court says that the Civil Rights Act provides that people shall not discriminate because of sex. Among the other factors I listed, because of sex. So how is that different? How does that allow us to interpret this in ways that it hasn't been interpreted before? They focus on the words because of. They say it's improper to focus particularly on the word sex, that we have to look at the words because of sex. And then what they say is that if, in fact, you look at, or if you define sex to simply have the traditional biological meaning that it's always been given, simply a man and a woman, that you cannot discriminate against somebody who's a homosexual of the same-sex persuasion or somebody who is a transgender individual unless you utilize sex. If you use simply the idea that sex means a man and a woman, that because of sex means you cannot discriminate against these people you can't discriminate against transgender people or homosexual people without having some idea of sex. The court says, quote, "It is impossible to discriminate a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex." It says, hey, look, if an employer has two employees, they're both men. One is heterosexual and is attracted to women, and the other is homosexual and attracted to men. If the employer fires the homosexual person and keeps the heterosexual person, it is illegally discriminating on the basis of sex, because without this idea of sex, there isn't a reason to fire the person. That it's because of the sex that this even matters. Well, is that true? Does that even make sense? And does that even make sense, in the way we need it to be applied here? It is as if what's really involved here is a little bit of a sleight of hand. The court is saying we're only going to use the word sex in the traditional biological sense of a male and a female. But if that's true, then how is it discrimination if you fire one man and then keep another man? You have to look at more than just the fact that a person is a man or a woman in this example, which the court uses. You have to look at what the person does. The court even says that the reason for the firing is because one of these individuals is attracted to men. The court says that one of these individuals is going to be fired. The homosexual individual is going to be fired because of his traits or actions. Well, what is a trait? What is an action? If you took the word action, first off, what we're looking at is a person is being fired because of what they do, not because of what they are in a strictly biological sense, but of what they do. And that is supported by the fact that the court is talking about, a man who's attracted to other men. We're talking about how the person behaves, how he lives. It's the person's actions. You've got two men. One gets fired, one doesn't. And the court says the firing of the homosexual individual is illegal discrimination. There is no difference between these two people if, in fact, we are looking at sex in the strictly biological sense. They're both men. It has to be something in addition to that is the cause of the problem. And it's this, what's in addition to it, that we're talking about. The court talks about traits or actions. The court says, quote, "The employer discriminates against him for traits or actions." So again, an action is obviously how someone behaves. What is a trait? A trait is defined, for example, if you go to the Cambridge English Dictionary, as a characteristic that leads to a certain type of behavior. Again, we're talking about action. I mean, what is a characteristic unless it's an element, it's something that shows our character? What kind of a character does a person have? How can we know a person's character apart from how they act, how they behave? In order to try to come up with a new interpretation of this term sex to include transgender people and homosexual people, the court is trying to establish a link. It needs to establish a link between who somebody is from a strictly biological sense and what they do. There has to be a link to their behavior. There has to be a link to what they do. But that link was not in the original statute. If you go back to how it was phrased and how it was intended back in 1964. There's a little song that kids used to hear on the Sesame Street program. for years and years and years. Probably still do. It's a little song about things that don't belong. Something about, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. And then it asks the kids to determine, what it is that doesn't belong. Maybe, you've got two buildings and a tree, and the kids are being asked to determine which of the things doesn't belong. Maybe you have two farm or barnyard animals and a fish. And then the kids are asked to determine, which of these things does not belong. What are you trying to ask the kids to do? Trying to ask the kids to detect a pattern. What is the pattern that's involved in this statute that the court is dissecting? It's simply this. There's a 5-word or a series of 5 different categories of prohibited activities. Race, color, religion, sex, national origin. What are those things? Normally, they're a series of nouns. Race is a noun. Color is a noun. Religion is a noun. Sex, in the strictly biological sense, male and female, is a noun. And national origin, that's a noun. If we include actions and traits or manners of acting, what are we talking about? Now we're talking about a verb. Race, again, is a noun. Color, again, is a noun. Religion, again, is a noun. Sex, if it includes transgenderism, where somebody says, they say, I am this type of person. They declare it. They declare what kind of pronouns they want to use. They self-identify. These are actions. You're not born. There are now 58 varieties or 56 on Facebook for different transgender categories that you can declare for yourself. We're not born that way. People pick their own pronouns, and there's an endless variety of them. You're not born with those pronouns. These are decisions people make. These are actions people take. If we're going to include this, now the word sex includes these other things that are linked to it. It includes actions. It includes, something in the sense of a verb. The same thing for homosexual people. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not people are born that way. But as I said before, in the example that the court uses, you've got two men. So if sex is limited, as the court says that it is using the word in such a limited sense, if it's limited to if sex strictly means the biological difference between a man and a woman, and you can take two men and say that, there can be discrimination between those two men, then you're adding something to this equation. If someone is attracted to other men, if they act in a way where, they show this attraction to other men, now we're talking about actions. We're talking about a verb. So now we have, in this string of 5, prohibited types of discrimination, we don't have a series of 5 different nouns. We have 4 nouns and a verb. If we put the court's analysis in this decision to this Sesame Street test, we would find one of these things does not belong. One of these things breaks the pattern. One of these things is different. This is why there's been an effort up till now to try to change the law. This has been why people have felt a need to try to change something, that something wasn't there already, that we needed to change the law accordingly. It's why people have felt this way. They've recognized this on a very intuitive, on a simple level, on an intuitive level. It doesn't say gender orientation. It doesn't say transgenderism. It doesn't say homosexuality. It says sex. And that's it. So the court is adding something here. For all of their pronouncements that's not what they're doing, it is certainly exactly what they're doing. We're having a sweeping new law created by a judicial decision. They have decided we are not going to let the legislature do this. If there have been efforts to change the law in the past, and the Congress has not been able to get to the point where they can actually pass that law, if the representatives of the people, the elected representatives of the people, have not gotten to the point where there's enough of a consensus that the law can be changed in Congress, why should the court do it? Why should they take it upon themselves to do it? Our letter from St. Paul said, love is not inflated. Is what the court is doing here, is it not inflated? Or is it inflated? Is it an act of humility? Or is it an act of arrogance? The critics of the court certainly think this is arrogant. Justice Alito, in his dissent, calls it some type of a brazen act of arrogance of unparalleled proportions. And why isn't he right? When a court decides what the word sex means, it's like when the court has made similar pronouncements in the past. In 1973, when it declared when life began. Now, I know people who analyze Roe will say that that's not exactly what it said, but it is what it did. It took the definition of when life begins out of the hands of state legislatures, out of the hands of any national legislature, who wouldn't have even had the authority to do it either, and just took it upon itself. When the court decided in the Obergefell case what marriage means, it took it away from the states. Marriage has traditionally been something left to the states. For centuries, that's been something, for our 200 years of history, more than 200 years of our history, this has been something that the states have decided this is a private matter, this is a personal matter, this is something for local governments to deal with. This is not a federal issue when marriages happen. That's why people will go to Nevada to get a divorce or a marriage, but they couldn't get in other places, because there was no universal or national or federal concept of marriage. Where is it necessary for the federal government to decide that? Our whole system of government is based on that there's a division between national government and state governments and local governments, that there's a place for local governments. If our national government gets to decide everything, then why even bother to have local governments? And similarly, the court here is deciding something of momentous social importance, something of deeply private, personal importance. And the court's deciding it for itself, by itself, and mandating that everybody in the country has to abide by this particular ruling. Is that not arrogance? Is that not inflated? Why not trust elected representatives to make this decision? And if in fact they can, it's because there is not a sufficient consensus. And if there is not a sufficient consensus to change the law, then it is an act of arrogance to step in and say, well, we'll take care of the problem. A proper act of humility would be to say, well, we just simply need to wait until there is a consensus. What's wrong with waiting? Why is it not humble to wait? Is it not arrogant to say, I'm tired of waiting? Of course that's arrogant. That's always arrogant. St. Paul says love is patient. This is an act of impatience. And you get impatient when you say, I demand that this, I'm tired of waiting. I want this to happen now. This is inflated. Why does a court do something like this? There's a study that was ordered by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in response to the priest scandal. And the John Jay College, at the behest of the Catholic bishops, conducted a very detailed and in-depth study of priestly abuse over a 60-year period from 1950 to 2010. For 60 years, they examined all manner of, large number of instances of Catholic abuse, trying to provide priestly abuse, trying to provide the Catholic Church with the best analysis that they could. And what did they find? One of the principal findings of that study was that priestly abuse peaked in the 1970s and 80s. And the other element of this finding was that priests were not immune to the culture. Priests were not immune to the society around them. That there was this, as you know, the term that's been famously coined for it, a sexual revolution in the 1960s. And that, in the 1960s and 1970s, this was growing, this was developing, and then guess what? It affected the priests as well. They were less prone to being chased and more prone to temptations of various sorts. Well, if it can affect priests, can it not also affect justices in our courts? Or are we to believe that our judges and justices are immune from what's going on in the society and the culture around them? If we tend to think in our society today that we can do everything, we can fashion the world the way we want it, we can, we can order our lives, we basically do not need God. If the entire culture around us, society around us, is becoming more and more secular, can our justices and our judges be immune from that? And what does it mean to be secular? Well, it involves, among other things, to a large extent, a feeling that we do not depend on God for anything. We can decide things for ourselves. Certainly the transgender movement involves that to a great degree. I can decide who I am. So this is the court, perhaps, falling prey to that same tendency. We can decide. We don't have to wait on anybody or anything. We can control things. We can create the world we want. We can do this. And this tendency where the outlook is one in which we don't really believe in God and we think of ourselves instead of God, then we can fall into these kinds of tendencies and we can decide things. And so it's easier to be arrogant. It's easier to be inflated. So that is certainly prevalent here. Why should the court not simply say, the statute doesn't say this, we need to wait until it does? You want to change the law, go to the Congress, get the law changed. What would be wrong in doing that? Why would it be wrong to turn to the elected representatives to do that? Well, we got the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973. Dramatic, sweeping consequences for society. Now we've got the Obergefell decision, and just within a few years now, this decision. We're getting in more rapid order decisions from courts that affect the most private parts of our lives, that make these philosophical decisions for all of us, based supposedly on statutory interpretation, based supposedly on the law. Well, what else is in St. Paul's letter? He talks about the truth. Well, do we have the truth here? Do we really know? I mean, do we really know whether or not we have the ability to identify ourselves? Do we really know whether or not, sexual proclivities are something we're born with? Are they, at least for some people, perhaps things that can be developed or, be the results of how we think? I mean, is it really something in our DNA? Is it really something we're hardwired with? Or is it more psychological? Well, there's a raging debate on that. Well, if there's a debate on that, how can the court then say that sex includes homosexuality and transgenderism. They're deciding that question too. They are saying, we know the truth. This is what the truth is. Even though there's a raging debate still a raging debate among experts. You see, one deviation from the correct manner of acting can easily, beget another. St. Paul talks about love. At the same time, he's talking about humility. At the same time, he's talking about truth. What is that? He's talking about love. At the same time, he's talking about truth. The court also can easily be swayed by the society and the culture today, in that they're afraid of being accused. It is often said, it is often maintained that if you allow discrimination in any form against somebody, however people tend to interpret this or feel discrimination, that if there's any kind of discrimination against somebody who identifies in some kind of transgender role, or somebody who comes out as homosexual, that you're an evil person, a bad person, a bigoted person. And so none of us wants to be accused. None of us wants to feel bad about these sorts of things. And so is that not something that also affects the court? And so it's a desire to be approved by the society at large. It's a fear of being ridiculed, is it not? So is the court immune from that? What does St. Paul talks about? St. Paul talks about the truth. That with the truth, you do not allow yourself to be worried about that. St. Paul says love is not inflated. It is humble. If you go to, there's a litany of humility that came out of at least the one I found, came out of a Jesuit prayer book in 1963. And it talks about, it's a prayer where you're asking God to keep you from the desire of being approved, the desire of being consulted, the desire of being praised or extolled. That's to be humble. If you don't want to be lauded or held up or, given some kind of grandeur from other people, that's certainly humble. That's true. But it also talks about, that same litany also talks about being freed of the fear of being disapproved, the fear of being ridiculed, to be freed from that. And why would a litany on humility talk about that? Because what kind of humility are we talking about? We're talking about humility which recognizes God. The ultimate humility, the true humility, is the humility that starts with the fact that there is a God, that he has established a design for us, a way for us. And it all starts there. And so if that's the case, then we are willing to stand up for the truth. If that's the case, then the litany of humility will say that we need to be freed from fear of being disapproved. And that is why the reading from St. Paul we gave earlier, talks about the truth. People then are willing to stand up for the truth. This writing from St. Paul also talks about people being willing to endure all things. Endure things for the truth? What are we talking about now? We're talking about having the courage to endure all things and standing up for the truth. If, in fact, our society is telling us at any time you do not grant everything that is asked with regard to people who are transgender or of the same-sex persuasion, that then we're cruel, we're mean, we're evil, we're bigoted. And if we have a fear of that, then we do not have true humility. Because then we have a fear of being disapproved. And if true humility is being willing to subject ourselves and surrender ourselves to the will of God. And, if that belief, our beliefs in God tell us that, we can't decide for ourselves who we are. There's lots of ways in which we can determine who we are in terms of how we exercise our free will. But if we recognize that there's a design for us, a plan for us, that we were made by God, that everything we have is a gift from God, that we cannot create ourselves, that we cannot play God, then that humility, that type of humility, mandates that we not be afraid to say those things, that we not be afraid to stand up for those things, that we not be afraid to stand up for the truth. And it would seem that the court does not have that kind of courage. That the court is succumbing to this fear of being ridiculed or criticized when it says, no, we can't wait for other people to decide this. We have to decide this in a way that other people for the last 50 years didn't see and wouldn't expect. There's an encyclical written by Pope Paul VI, and it was a very famous encyclical. Came out in 1968, called Humanae Vitae, and at the time it was thought that the Pope, after Vatican II, after the Church was opening up more to the modern world and trying to find its place in the modern world, that the Church would now all of a sudden recognize that contraception would be permissible. And that was what was eagerly anticipated. And then Pope Paul VI came out with this encyclical Humanae Vitae, which he said the opposite. And a lot of people were very frustrated and disappointed. But what he wrote at the time is significant to us. He talked about the fact that it was a remarkable development, that man had made stupendous progress in the domination and rational organization of the forces of nature, to the point that he is endeavoring to extend this control over every aspect of his own life, over his body, over his mind and emotions, over his social life, and even over the laws that regulate the transmission of life. So here we have the Pope in 1968 living in a world where there have been tremendous advances in the fields of science. The things that were being done by surgery, organs being transplanted, that had never been possible before. Tremendous advances in the field of science. Domination of the forces of nature over his own body. Also over his mind and emotions. The whole field of psychology in the 20th century, starting with with Sigmund Freud and so forth, that had made such tremendous strides, and there is such emphasis being placed on regulating our minds and emotions, controlling our minds and emotions through the progress made in psychology. And then he also talked about the progress made over social life. The whole civil rights movement of the 1960s was trying to regulate and take control over, social interactions in ways that, hadn't been done before. So this was a time of tremendous change, and the Pope recognized all this, and he talked about this temptation, if you will, to look at all of this progress and then believe that we could regulate everything, that it was within our power to regulate everything. But that is a bit of a deception, that there is more to this life than, simply the 70 years or so that we happen to walk upon this earth. That there is another life, that there is a spiritual side to us, a side that lives on. There's a whole nother realm to reality. And it's that realm, if we recognize it, that will lead us to understand that there is a design to our lives, that we take our origin from God, and that this design involves us cooperating with God. In the creation of life, we cooperate with God in that way. And when we do, we foster a deep union between a man and a woman. If we allow for, the natural production of new life. And that when we do that, then we're really getting in touch with the design given to us by God for our lives, which is love. The reading from St. Paul was all about love. And St. Paul's talking about the same thing. The contraception, this avoidance of the idea that we can regulate when we will allow life to be and when we will decide that it won't be, that if we avoid that, we're really getting closer to having a union between married people, a union of love. Why would he say that? Why would he say that? Well, it's because if you take the creation of life out of this picture, if you take a marital relationship and say, well, it's not all about generating life, that you can take a pill so that you can enjoy sexual activity without having to worry about this. If you can gratify your own desires without having to worry about whether or not you're going to have a baby, that you're making something mechanical about it, something pleasure-oriented about it. And that gets you farther away from love, from true love. Pope Paul VI talks about that if you live, if you live in a marital relationship, and you allow this cooperation with God to generate new life, that involves going beyond. That was the phrase to use. He talks about to go beyond this life to bring new life into being. What's he talking about? There's a transcendental aspect to this. This is transcendentalism. We get to go beyond who we are. We get to create a life that will live past ours. That in and of itself has a transcendental component to it. And how do we do that? You do that through a relationship where you love the other person. It all fits together. And this is why he was able to say that, if we live in the design given to us by God, that, we get closer to creating this union, the union between the husband and a wife and the child, and a union between the husband, the wife, and the child and God. It flows together. It goes together. It all flows together. And the more we separate ourselves from each other, the more we separate ourselves from any union of that nature. If we bring contraception into this, there's a wall that's built in between a man and a woman. It's not completely natural anymore. We're adding things to it. We're adding certain, obstacles and blockages to complete love, where you give yourself to the other person completely. He talks about this, where he says, the problem with it, with contraception is that it would open things wide to all kinds of extensions of this concept. These actions do not occur divorced from ideas. And there's an idea that was created with contraception. And the idea was that we can create, we can control, and we can separate ourselves from other people and other things we do not like. And that separation then continues to grow. Once you start it, it continues to grow. And that's what we're living through. Pope Paul VI was ridiculed at the time. The idea was, well, this is too old-fashioned, too old hat. It's just out of step with things. But he related it to some very basic fundamental concepts. He related it to God. He related it to love. He related it to the union between people. He related it to all of these things and said, if we get away from that, there is a danger that we're going to fall farther and farther away from each other. We're going to lose the union that we have with each other. And that's, of course, the same thing we're talking about with St. Paul. That once you get away from certain ideas, you're going to go farther and farther down paths that deviate from the reality. If you stay within things that are true, if you maintain paths that are truthful, then everything else will be consistent. And other things, you will be consistent with other things that are truthful. And that if you get away from one, you're going to get away from another. And that's what we're living through. This is, this is what we're dealing with. First, we had contraception in the 1960s. What came from that? Then we had, in the 70s, no-fault divorce. Once we started this, this pattern of separating ourselves from each other in marriage, now all of a sudden we had no-fault divorce. And the whole idea of premarital sex, which was a stigma at the time, is now completely lost. Where is the connection between people? The most intimate physical activity between people, which should be something that is engaged in only out of love, now has become so commonplace. We are losing a connection. Our connection with one another. We're seeing this in so many different ways. In our society right now, it's hard enough to maintain connections with people. We are using social media to such an extent that people are now becoming separated from one another in additional ways. We're losing the ability to relate to one another, to talk to one another civilly. We don't know how to relate to each other anymore. We're losing this. Is it any coincidence that these things that Paul VI was afraid of in the 1960s, preceded all of this separation that we're feeling today? Is this just a coincidence? Is there nothing connected with any of it? The court in this case, we're dealing with a case in which the highest court in the United States has now said that transgenderism is right. It is true. It is the truth for our country. Other people can have different opinions on this, but this is the truth. And we can tell you. We can decide for you. We can do this. We are not elected. There are 100 different legislatures. You've got houses, of representatives, and you've got senates in all the different 50 states. We've got, of course, the House of Representatives and the Senate for the entire United States. We've got all of these legislative bodies, and there can be all kinds of different opinions on this, all kinds of opinions on what is the truth, but we know what it is. By a vote of 6-3, we can tell you what the truth is for everybody. Can they? How can they? And what do we do now when this happens? Do we stand up? Do we speak and say that this is not right? This is not right simply on a legal level, because the court is making law. Despite all its pronouncements to the contrary, it is making law. And do we complain about that? If we do, are we going to be criticized? And if we are criticized, do we have the courage to stand up for it? And what happens if we don't? What happens if we don't stand up? What happens if we don't maintain that, there is a God and there is an authority that we should at least consider? Is this in accord with God's will? No, a court won't deal with that. A court won't say that. A court won't write that in their opinion. If they did, my goodness, the outcry would be tremendous. Courts are not supposed to concern themselves with that. But what about state legislatures? What about members of Congress? Can't they think that? Can't they say that? Can't they use that as a basis for how they're going to vote on legislation? Yes, of course they can. Which is another reason why this decision by the court is wrong. And if we are no longer capable of saying, if we're going to decide our major issues in courts, which don't have to consider whether or not this is in keeping with God's plan at all, then we are taking out of our social network God entirely, which perhaps there's no coincidence in that either, that courts have for a lot of years been mandating that God be removed from our society, from the public sphere, from our schools, from public, nativity scenes in various public places, from crosses in cemeteries, from all kinds of, different displays of faith. Perhaps that's no coincidence that this is also occurring through our courts and not necessarily through our legislatures. So we're faced with another incident of a court deciding what is true without having to bring God into the picture at all. Of course, the problem is, if there is a God, then it's completely wrong to divorce our decisions from God. Be that as it may, we need, nevertheless, to stand up and maintain that this is true, because if we do know one thing, we know that there is a truth. We know that it's a truth that St. Paul proclaimed in all of his letters. And if he were here today, it would be in his letters to America. There is this truth. This truth is Jesus Christ. We have to keep him in our lives and in what we say and what we do. And we can't be afraid to speak out about that. That is truly being humble. Well, this has been Ray Gerard. There's been another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. We hope you've enjoyed this. We hope you found it a little stimulating, and we hope you will join us again. And until the next time, God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.